Breaking. The Pentagon has officially confirmed that 6 American service members are dead following a devastating Iranian counterattack in Kuwait, completely shattering the administration's narrative that our forces were secure. This tragic loss of life comes immediately after the massive U.S.-Israeli joint strike on Tehran, proving that the operation triggered a deadly retaliation that our military was seemingly unprepared to stop. You are being told that this offensive was a flawless geopolitical victory, but the reality on the ground is that thousands of our soldiers are now trapped in a rapidly escalating regional war. This catastrophic failure of defensive planning directly threatens to drag the United States into a prolonged ground conflict that will instantly destabilize global markets and send your daily cost of living skyrocketing. It raises an incredibly disturbing question that the establishment media refuses to ask right now. Did the Trump administration intentionally launch this massive daytime offensive without implementing any extraction or defense plan for the 3,000 American troops already sitting in the crosshairs? Here's what they're not telling you about the immediate aftermath of the strikes, and the documented truth is far more terrifying than the carefully crafted press briefings. The official timeline of events completely contradicts the political promises being made to the American public today. What is happening in the Middle East right now will fundamentally change the global economy, and you cannot afford to look away. To fully understand the sheer magnitude of this unprecedented military crisis, we must look at the deeply documented historical escalation that led directly to this week's fatal counterattacks. Following decades of proxy warfare, the United States and Israel launched a massive, synchronized daytime attack, utilizing over 100 aircraft to strike nearly 2,000 targets inside Iran. This operation successfully eliminated Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, which President Donald Trump proudly declared on Truth Social was the ultimate justice that ended a decades-long threat. Yet, instead of ending the hostilities, this aggressive decapitation strike predictably ignited a massive powder keg across the entire region. The documented contradiction here is staggering, as the administration promised immediate deterrence, but actually delivered a scenario where Iranian proxies instantly unleashed a barrage of retaliatory missiles at U.S. outposts. Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, a vocal member of the Armed Services Committee, accurately warned about this exact scenario, stating, "We are putting our troops in harm's way without a clear mission, and we are bypassing Congress to do it." The timing of this cannot be ignored, as the administration aggressively pushed for a swift military victory right in the middle of a fiercely contested political environment back home. By prioritizing speed and violence of action over defensive logistics, military planners left sprawling bases in Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait completely exposed to the inevitable blowback. The horrific result is a growing casualty list that the Pentagon is desperately trying to manage before public panic sets in. The administration claimed that unprecedented cyber operations and overwhelming air superiority would completely paralyze Iran's ability to strike back at our forward-deployed forces. However, the catastrophic breach of our missile defense systems in Kuwait tells a completely different, highly verifiable story. This glaring failure points directly to a terrifying statistical reality that the Defense Department has been trying to bury for years. When you look past the partisan talking points and examine the actual military logistics, the numbers don't lie. According to the Department of Defense's own personnel tracking data, roughly 3,000 American service members remain stationed in heavily targeted, isolated bases scattered across Iraq and Syria. These bases, including the Al-Assad Air Base and the Al-Tanf Garrison, have been aggressively attacked over 160 times by Iran-backed militias like Kataib Hezbollah in recent years, proving definitively that they were already operating in a severely compromised environment. Despite this well-documented history of extreme vulnerability, the administration proceeded with the massive Tehran strikes without aggressively reinforcing these specific, known targets. The devastating human cost of this strategic oversight is now a matter of public record, with the Pentagon releasing the names of the fallen, including 35-year-old Captain Cody Cork and 42-year-old First Class Noah Tietjens. These aren't just abstract military statistics. These are American citizens who were left entirely exposed to an entirely predictable retaliatory strike. Beyond the immense human tragedy, the raw economic data surrounding this crisis is already showing signs of a catastrophic global panic. Brent crude oil futures immediately spiked on the international market, mathematically guaranteeing that the financial shockwaves of this military blunder will hit your wallet before the end of the week. The sheer scale of the destabilization proves that the administration's claim of a clean, consequence-free surgical strike was a complete fabrication. You are watching a localized tactical failure rapidly mutate into a global economic disaster that will impact every single household in America. The ripple effects of losing control over the Middle East's primary energy corridors are just beginning to manifest in the domestic market. And this leads us to the most enraging aspect of this entire geopolitical catastrophe. The immediate fallout in Washington has completely shattered any illusion of a unified national security strategy, exposing a vicious political civil war over who is ultimately responsible for abandoning our troops. We are witnessing a historic, deeply documented split within the government, as constitutional conservatives clash violently with the executive branch over the unchecked use of presidential war powers. Republican Senator Rand Paul explicitly condemned the strategy of leaving these bases exposed, stating, "It is a mistake to leave our troops as sitting ducks in Iraq and Syria, as a tripwire for a larger war." Conversely, the establishment hawkish wing is demanding even more aggressive escalation, completely ignoring the horrific reality that our defensive perimeters have already been fatally breached. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has repeatedly demanded overwhelming force, declaring, "We must hit Iran directly and hit them hard to stop the aggression." This fundamental contradiction between promising troop safety and demanding endless escalation completely paralyzes Congress, while our soldiers remain under active hostile fire. This bitter, hyper-partisan gridlock brings us right back to the terrifying, unresolved question regarding the absolute lack of an extraction plan before the Tehran strikes. Did the Pentagon knowingly leave these specific bases heavily exposed, because withdrawing them would have signaled our offensive intentions to the Iranian intelligence network? The political establishment absolutely refuses to answer this, opting instead to point fingers, while defense contractors quietly secure massive new logistics contracts. While politicians safely debate military theory behind arms security in Washington, the brutal consequences of their delayed actions are compounding by the hour. The terrifying reality of this strategic failure cannot be contained within the borders of the Middle East anymore. This crisis is aggressively expanding, and the financial devastation is heading straight for your local community. And this is where it gets personal, because the consequences of this severe congressional paralysis and executive hubris extend far beyond the battlefield. The immediate effect of this escalating regional war will be felt within days at the gas pump, as global shipping giants continuously reroute massive cargo vessels away from the heavily militarized Strait of Hormuz. This sudden, massive logistical disruption drives up international freight costs exponentially, and those extra charges are instantly passed directly on to you, the American consumer. In the medium term, this rapidly expanding foreign crisis directly threatens the livelihood and lifelong savings of millions of everyday Americans who are completely disconnected from the military-industrial complex. Your retirement portfolios, pension funds, and 401k accounts are heavily exposed to the incredibly volatile international energy markets, which violently swing based on these unchecked executive military actions. A single, unannounced barrage of Iranian ballistic missiles against a Saudi oil facility can wipe out months of steady market gains overnight. You are essentially being forced to financially underwrite a massive geopolitical gamble that was executed without basic defensive precautions for our own troops. Looking at the harsh, long-term reality, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office has repeatedly documented that unfunded overseas military entanglements directly and massively explode the national debt. This out-of-control deficit spending mathematically guarantees drastically higher tax burdens for the working class over the next decade, completely stifling domestic economic growth. We are funding a multi-trillion-dollar strategy that traps thousands of Americans in a perpetual war zone without any coherent, achievable exit strategy or basic defensive safeguards. Let that sink in for a moment as you consider the sheer scale of the deception and the immense financial burden being placed entirely on your shoulders. The American public is being forced to bleed both financially and literally to cover up a catastrophic failure in military planning. This brings us back to the most critical, horrifying question regarding why our forces were left entirely exposed to an entirely predictable Iranian counterattack. Are our elected leaders intentionally obscuring the massive operational danger to avoid public accountability? Or are they blindly following a misguided strategy of global projection? The documented evidence, extracted from recent military briefings and historical oversight hearings, reveals a terrifying reality about how these life and death decisions are actually calculated. The veil of national security is aggressively used to hide severe logistical incompetence from the taxpayers who are actively funding these doomed operations. We are finally uncovering the specific, documented reasons why the administration rushed into this offensive without securing our own vulnerable flanks first. The truth is buried in the operational timeline, and it completely destroys the narrative of a flawless military victory. We can finally resolve the massive question of why the true vulnerability of our forward-deployed forces was completely ignored during the planning phases of the Tehran strikes. The rigorously documented military record, specifically relying on statements from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Air Force General Dan Kane, provides clear, factual explanations for this disaster. These aren't wild conspiracy theories. These are the actual, stated operational priorities of the United States military establishment, functioning exactly as designed. The first rigorously documented explanation is that military planners prioritized absolute secrecy and overwhelming speed over the defensive posturing of existing regional bases. General Kane explicitly confirmed that the massive daytime operation was designed to provide speed, surprise, and violence of action, meaning that moving 3,000 troops out of harm's way beforehand would have completely telegraphed the attack. They intentionally chose to leave our soldiers sitting in known, heavily targeted coordinates to ensure the element of surprise against the Iranian leadership. The second explanation, heavily debated by military analysts and congressional oversight committees, points directly to a controversial, unstated strategy of maintaining human tripwires. By keeping American forces stationed in highly vulnerable outposts across Iraq and Kuwait, any aggressive Iranian retaliation forces a massive, fully funded military response from a reluctant Congress. In this deeply cynical scenario, the administration essentially uses the inevitable casualties as undeniable political leverage to legally justify and fund a broader, prolonged regional war. The third major factor driving this deadly calculation is purely tied to the domestic political calendar and the desperate need for a historic, legacy-defining victory. Administrations historically rush complex, massive military operations to secure overwhelming domestic approval ratings, often deliberately suppressing the highly classified risk assessments regarding inevitable enemy counterattacks. This is exactly why the initial casualty reports out of Kuwait were heavily delayed, allowing the administration to dominate the news cycle with the victory of Khamenei's elimination before the body bags started coming home. So, if the government knowingly accepted the severe risk to our troops to guarantee a tactical surprise, you have to ask yourself if the geopolitical trade-off was actually worth American lives. The undeniable, factual reality is that our service members were left heavily exposed to continuous hostile fire, purely to facilitate an executive military objective. The consequences of that calculated decision are now entirely irreversible, and the death toll is currently rising. The documented truth is that the administration launched a massive, historic military offensive, while entirely failing to protect the 3,000 American troops already stationed within the enemy's immediate strike range. Politicians in Washington are now shamelessly scrambling to leverage this tragedy for cheap, partisan campaign talking points, generating endless fundraising emails, while offering absolutely zero tactical solutions to the families of the fallen. This is documented, and this is not opinion. We are currently witnessing a fundamental, catastrophic breakdown in constitutional war powers, where the executive branch gambles with American lives with incredibly little oversight or logistical restraint. Simultaneously, the legislative branch is far too fractured and paralyzed by internal civil wars to implement anything resembling a coherent, unified strategy to extract our forces from this nightmare. Are you comfortable living under a government that treats its own military personnel as acceptable collateral damage, strictly under the convenient guise of national security? I want you to head down to the comments right now and critically answer this highly debated, incredibly uncomfortable question that is dividing military strategists today. Should Congress immediately and forcefully mandate the withdrawal of all remaining troops from the Middle East to prevent further casualties? Or would a sudden retreat permanently destroy American deterrence and invite massive attacks on the homeland? There are valid, terrifying arguments on both sides, and the political establishment is absolutely terrified of the American public finally demanding an answer. As we discussed earlier in the broadcast, the Pentagon's own released casualty reports conclusively prove that our troops in Kuwait were fatally left behind to absorb the blowback of this offensive. I will be releasing a massive, fully documented financial investigation tomorrow exposing the exact, named defense contractors profiting billions from this specific, engineered regional instability. You need to be ready for that revelation, so take action now and click the link in the description below to immediately access the unclassified Defense Department casualty records.